let's start with maybe the biggest overarching problem, which I think is a trust problem. And if you go and look at polls over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, you'll see that at virtually every institution, major institution in America, including law enforcement, including the government, including private institutions that are public facing, like the media, whatever, they've all lost dramatically lost trust. In many cases, almost, 60, 70, 80% of Americans will say they don't trust particular institutions. And so when you have that, you definitely have people asking themselves what they can do, what sort of workaround they can affect when an institution, at least in their mind, isn't doing its job properly. So there's that. We talked about crime. Obviously, there's been a spike in certain kinds of crimes. I know there has, some crimes have not gone up, certain property crimes, but the biggie, right, which is homicides, that's risen. And it's risen just in the last three or 4 years. It's stayed relatively high.
Well, it's declining now, but
okay.
it is still higher than the pre-2020 levels.
Right.
And yes, there was a jump that went almost back to the 1990s levels, which were much more, people haven't realized that the last 20 years have been relatively low.
Well,
murder rate in the United States.
If you look at the murder rate, you'll see that it's gone since the 90s. It's gone down, 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 and then it's sort of up. It's ticked up again. It's not where it was in the 70s, which was, I think, at least in recent history, the highest it was in our country. But in 2020, 2021, it got pretty close. And I think, again, some of this isn't necessarily entirely about reality. It's about perception, right? I mean, perception is ultimately true or not true or partly true, is what drives people to do things. And in this case is driving people to buy guns and train how to use them. So there's crime, there's trust. There's a sense of, I think polarization, political polarization and social polarization certainly helps. Again, I mentioned COVID and its impact. So you used the word perfect storm a few minutes ago. I think we came pretty close to that. And I think, as I say in the piece, while I understand why someone might say, oh, I think I need something here to protect myself because I'm much more concerned about my safety than I used to be. On the other hand, a society in which, say, I don't know, another 25 or 30 or 40 million people now have firearms, I'm not so sure that's a better society. And I mean, I just worry that, again, gun accidents, people getting upset and shooting each other. I assume, and again, I can't imagine that I'm wrong about this, that it's just much more likely when people are armed than when they're not. And it's sad that people feel the need, and it's not a criticism of them, but it's sad when people feel the need to do this. Most of us who don't really probably are probably not all that interested in guns, not interested in hunting or these other things, probably wouldn't own a handgun, but for this fear. And so who wants to go through life afraid? No one. Who wants to feel this necessity? I'm sure the people who are buying these guns would much prefer not to feel it. So I see it as obviously I support the right to purchase firearms for self-defense, hunting, any reason like that. But I also feel like it's too bad that we've reached a state in our country where this is happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of gun rights advocates would disagree with the last bit about more people owning guns being a negative. Obviously, they would, most gun rights advocates feel the other way, that it's a positive. But I do think that this perspective of looking at as somebody who supports gun rights generally, like you do, also recognizing that the reason why a lot more people are buying guns now is not necessarily a positive one, right? Like that's a much more interesting conversation to me, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of gun owners, a lot of gun rights advocates would argue that people should own guns, that maybe, people are kind of, and maybe you can, especially coming from a libertarian think tank, from a libertarian standpoint, that people are too trusting of law enforcement or the government to offer them protection, in even just normal times.
Yes.
Right. That this is a common argument you hear in gun rights circles that like, my 45 is faster than 911. Right. Or whatever.
Right.
Or when seconds matter, the police are minutes away. These are common tropes or arguments that you hear. There's obviously truth to them, but it gets at this idea that people that there's a belief that people are too trusting of government in this way. It's for their own personal safety as it is. Yeah. And so when these issues arise, it is sort of chaos happens and people start to reconsider that calculation and they buy a gun. I think people view that as in the gun owning community as a positive thing. But you're saying that, I think this is something I've thought as well, that, if a lot more people are buying guns because they're really worried about the state of the country, that they may need some sort of deadly force protection in the near future, that's not necessarily a positive societal sign.
That's right.
That's what you're getting at here.
Yeah. So let me sort of bracket my response with a couple of things. One is I grew up around guns, so I'm not unfamiliar with them. My dad was a big hunter, a big skeet shooter. Guns were a big part of his recreational life. And I joined him in all of that when I was a teenager, when I was a young man. We did a lot of that sort of thing together. I never really enjoyed it all that much. I did it largely because I wanted to spend time with him. But I came to respect his use of guns, the safety, his commitment to safety, his commitment to being very careful. I got to know a lot of his friends in that world, and I liked them personally, and I found them again very responsible in their use of guns. So I have a positive view of at least that gun community, and I have no doubt that people who are buying guns for, as I think I said in the piece, people who are buying guns for self-defense, I'm sure they're almost all law-abiding, decent people. And again, I am someone who thought at one point that I would. I've thought at times that I would join them. But
the reason we know that a lot of people bought guns during that period is not because there's a national registry that can tell us how many guns are out there. It's because we follow the background check numbers. So people presumably who are buying them can pass a background check to get them, which indicates that what we're seeing with that increase was, law-abiding people buying guns.
And as David Masci points out in another discourse piece, we see an uptick in the number of people who are training to use guns. And so, that's a good thing too. Obviously, you don't want someone just buying a gun, loading it and walking around. So all of that is good. So my criticism is not of gun owners. It's a criticism more of our country and the direction in which we're headed.